Gentlemen, and welcome to the Physician Enterprise, a Governance Perspective webinar. My name is Derek, and I'll be your operator for today. All participants on a listen-only mode. We shall facilitate a question and answer session at the end of the conference. If you're operator assistance, press *0, and the operator will be happy to assist you. This time, I would like to turn the conference over to Ms. Michelle Cooper, Senior Vice President and CHI Corporate Responsibility Officer. Please proceed.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. We're happy to be able to provide one of our quarterly webcast education sessions geared towards board members and audit and compliance committee members. We're going to focus on physician enterprise from a governance perspective, spend a little bit of time just talking about CHI's strategy when it comes to physician enterprise and then some of the compliance implications associated with that. We have three speakers that I'd like to introduce. We have Kent Carr, who is the Vice President and Chief Clinical Officer for the Physician Enterprise. We have Peter Saby, who is Corporate Counsel and is responsible for Physician Enterprise from a legal perspective, and then Sherry Ballard, who is the Vice President of Corporate Responsibility and has oversight over the physician practices. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Sherry Ballard, and she is going to offer a reflection, and we will start our webcast. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Sherry Ballard. Thank you so much for joining today. We want to begin this time together as we begin all meetings throughout CHI with a brief time of reflection, and we want to make sure that we're remaining grounded in the mission and the core values that we share. And so today I'd like to focus on the core value of integrity. Integrity is evident in our every action and deed. Integrity means moral wholeness, sincerity, fidelity, trust, and truthfulness in all we do. When integrity is present within a work culture, we see open and timely communication, a shared and deliberate desire to maintain high ethical standards. We hear people talking about their intention to do the right thing. Integrity is also reflected in personal humility and a culture characterized by service. Leaders are servant leaders. Integrity calls us to seek to understand one another deeply and together strive to serve the greater good. Finally, integrity is present in the practice of stewardship. This is when we recognize our resources, earthly, human, financial, and material, precious gifts entrusted to us to be carefully cultivated and valued. Integrity then is foundational to the quality of our work culture. Integrity rests in our hands each day and in everything we do. Let us ask, how is integrity expressed through me? How is integrity experienced by others whom I touch through the work I do? And how does the core view of integrity inform how I think about my role and my relationship with myself, my co-workers, and those for whom I am in service? The question is this: make us healing ministry find expression in and through each of us. Core value of integrity continue to influence and find expression in our every action and deed, and most importantly, in our relationship with ourselves, each other, and those for whom we are in service. The heritage of the healing mission entrusted to us be a flame that burns brightly in, through, and among us. So, thank you, and we'll get started with the presentation. I'd like to review briefly the objectives for the webcast today. We'd like to increase the knowledge of CHI Physician Enterprise from a governance perspective. So we hope at the end of the presentation you will have a good understanding of the current structure and state of CHI Physician Enterprise, that you will understand the risks that are associated with Physician Enterprise. We're going to highlight for you some risk mitigation strategies specific to Physician Enterprise that are in place and which you can participate in from a governance perspective, and then that you understand, again, the board's role in overseeing Physician Enterprise from the governance perspective. So we're going to start by reviewing the history, structure, and strategy of CHI Physician Enterprise, and for that we'll turn it over to Kent Carr.
And this is Kent Carr, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about the Physician Enterprise. we talk about the physician enterprise, or the PE, sometimes it's abbreviated. We're usually referring to our employed providers and our employed medical groups across the different markets in CHI. May not be the best term, because right now we employ a lot of our providers that we employ are not physicians. They're advanced practice clinicians, but that's sort of the historical term that's been out there for our employed physician groups. We've been employing physicians in our markets for over 30 years, but really there hasn't been a whole lot of national emphasis on the physician enterprise until, from my timeline, 2011, we hired my boss, Cliff Devaney, who's the senior vice president of the physician enterprise, and at that point we started to put more resources to the physician enterprise. We were realizing that it was becoming a much more important part of our business, and we also were expecting significant growth across the physician enterprise. So as you can see from the timeline, at that time there were about 1,800 providers, and now we're close to 4,000 providers within CHI. Things to notice on the timeline, things that Cliff put in place when he first came were some strategic milestones for the physician enterprise, and that was really to set some structure for the different medical groups across CHI. There really was not a standard structure, and those milestones were put in place. I'm going to talk a little bit about CHIPS, which is another one of the important initiatives that we put in place. So the next slide, all of our markets at this time have what I call a pluralistic approach to our providers. And really that means is that for our integrated providers, we relate to them in many different ways. So there may be co-management agreements, professional service agreements, medical directorships, joint ventures, and also other contracts. And with more independent physicians, what I'm going to talk about today in my comments are going to be focused on mainly our employed providers, but I know Peter mentioned some of the issues that may be out there even with some of our contracted providers in the markets. So when I came out of residency in 1987, really there wasn't much employment of physicians at that time. And, you know, it was in the 1990s was sort of the first peak of employment, and then, you know, it has picked up again. This is just some of the traditional reasons why we employed physicians. And it started when our traditional medical staff could no longer meet the needs of the systems. And sometimes these were offensive hiring, and sometimes it was defensive, so that providers didn't end up employed by competing systems. Probably the two biggest traditional reasons that we hired physicians was to try to increase our market share. And generally you think about primary care physicians controlling a population of patients. A big reason that we employed physicians and was the need of acute care hospitals. So there were hospital-based physicians that we needed to recruit into the systems, and there were certain service lines that we needed specialists, whether it was cardiologists, orthopedists, to help to staff our acute care hospital. So in some respects, those sorts of physicians, as medical groups, served as a staffing company for our acute care hospitals. So they're evolved, and we're now employing for those same reasons, but also some others, in that they, from the basis of our networks, they also help us with our coordination, help us to manage populations. So that the reasons for employment are continuing to evolve, but as far as the trend towards employing physicians, that continues to increase. I mentioned a couple of the national trends for employment, and that is that physician and APC employment continues to increase. There are a rising number of practice acquisitions. It is getting harder and harder to practice independently with all the regulations and costs that are out there to practice medicine. Increasing competition, so it's not just medical groups and health systems employing physicians, but we have health plans like Optum or Highmark that are now employing large numbers of providers in competition to health systems. And last dot point, just sort of thought, we have some health systems that are really leading with their physician groups, not so much their acute care hospitals. So just shows our history of employment. Really, all of our divisions have had significant and steady growth in their employment of providers. And as I mentioned, we have close to 4,000 providers now within CAI. There's a couple comments I want to make about the mix of providers. Right now, we only have 31% of our employed providers being primary care physicians. So you can see that hospital-based and service line-based, that staffing of our acute care hospitals is still a large function of our employed medical groups right now. In the second pie graph, you can also see that now close to 35% of our employed providers are advanced practice clinicians, and by that I mean nurse practitioners or physician assistants that are now providing care to our patients. That's continued to increase over the last several years, and we think it's going to continue to increase. So we put in place these medical groups, and as Cliff laid out our 15 milestones in 2011 when he came on board, really our goal was to try to establish high-performing medical groups. And the advisory board had a 150-page paper that they put out of, what are the characteristics of high-performing medical groups. A lot of that is in structure, communication, reporting, those sorts of things that form high-performing medical groups. So that's really been our approach, to get the medical groups, the basic structure in place, and part of that basic structure we need to begin to move to the new era and begin to manage populations. So we have individual medical groups in each of our markets. Nationally, they come together in a group called the Medical Group Leadership Council, or MGLC, and that's a group that I get together about a month on the phone call, and every couple months coming together. And it's I know you can't read the names on this, but it's just to represent that there's a dyad pair from each of the markets that are the leaders of that medical group. It's usually a clinical leader and an administrative leader. Come together and we work on, what can we do together to have higher performing medical groups? What things should we standardize across our different groups? Share best practices across our medical groups. And we also bring together our shared services leaders. We have our support services under a shared services model. And it's a chance for those leaders of the shared services to meet with all the medical group leaders to move groups forward. So one of the big initiatives that we started a couple of years ago, we're forming our medical groups and moving towards high-performing medical groups. We looked at the variance across the group. One area where we found a significant amount of opportunity was in the revenue cycle. So a formal discernment process, and decided to partner with one of the leaders of revenue cycle out in the market, and that was MedSynergy. So we formed a joint venture management service organization we call CHIPS. It's focused on the revenue cycle, but there are other services that we also deliver through CHIPS, such as employment of our non-providers, HR functions, patient outreach, and we've been implementing that across our markets over the last 2 years in a phased fashion. We've just put all of our legacy practices now onto the CHIPS platform, and I hope to begin to offer that to our non-employed affiliated providers in the future. I mentioned a couple of highlights about the history of the physician enterprise. I mentioned the MGLC and the leadership structure. I think that's become much stronger, and those leaders of the medical group learn from each other and push each other to improve their performance. Now with Tennessee going live this past month, we now have all of our ambulatory practices on electronic health records. We're also looking at the business operations of our practices much more carefully and a more deliberate rationalization of who we employ, who we don't employ, and the locations of our practices. So another important thing we put in place some work standards and compensation guidelines. About a year ago that we put in place the guidelines, and the practices have been moving their compensation plans to a more of a standard model, and a model that will allow us to expand our coverage of underserved areas as well as begin to move us towards value-based purchasing. So another bright spot has been our growth, and I want to comment on that again. Again, with the new comp plan, we've been able to expand our Medicaid coverage for our patients, and we've also been expanding our patient-centered medical home rollout across the markets. All is rosy with our medical groups. We still have a lot of improvement to be made. Our provider and patient satisfactions are a couple of the measures that we are looking to improve, and our quality metrics on the ambulatory side are underdeveloped, and although some are doing very well in the markets, we nationally don't have a very good reporting system for that. Next, some of our growth. I showed the number of providers, but as far as net revenue, we're now make up 11% of the net revenue across CHI, and we've been growing at 15% a year. As you can see from this slide, we're now close to a $1.5 billion business within CHI, and a very important part of the healthcare enterprise in all of our markets. I just wanted to one quick comment on some of the things we're working on. These are the targets and the priorities that the medical group is working on for the next year. We're very supportive of the Living Mission metrics that I'm sure most of us have seen as part of your boards, but both of those are acute care focused, so we wanted to have some things that, since our practices are more ambulatory focused, that we worked on. I mentioned our engagement of our employees and our providers. That's one of our core initiatives. Improving our patient experience, and we measure CG caps in all of our practices and are working to improve our willingness to recommend. I mentioned the need to develop a standardized sort of automatic reporting of our ambulatory quality results, looking to grow our patient base and measuring our unique patient lives that we touch. And then information, trying to move us more from that staffing for the acute care hospital to growing our primary care and expanding our patient-centered medical home. I know a little bit quick, but I wanted to just give you a little bit of an overview of the physician enterprise, and now I'm going to turn it over to Peter. So he's going to talk about some of the risks associated with the physician enterprise.
Thank you, Savy, and I'm happy to be with you. I'll just briefly touch on the major federal fraud and abuse laws that impact the work that we do in the physician enterprise, and specifically relationships with both employed and independent physicians. I refer you to a presentation that webcast that's available, and I believe we're sending out links to this after this presentation, but you'll get a link to a webcast called Whistleblowers, a Governance Perspective, and another one called Key Regulatory Concerns, a Governance Perspective. Go into great detail and on some of the specifics I'll just remind you that the anti-kickback statute prohibits offering, paying, soliciting, or receiving of value to induce or reward referrals to generate federal health care program business. The Stark Law is, of course, physician-specific, and it prohibits the physician from referring their patients for designated health services to an entity which the physician or an immediate family member has a financial relationship, unless one of the Stark exceptions applies. And the FUNDS Act is a broader act that doesn't merely deal with health care, but it also is intended to prevent people from knowingly presenting or causing false or fraudulent claims for payment or approval, and that, of course, deals with Medicare and Medicaid. I'll let Sherry chime in if she has time on open payments and CHI's approach to dealing with the Sunshine Act for the open payments. In general, that deals with physician relationships to teaching hospitals and medical device and other pharmaceutical type companies. Enforcement trends. So clearly increased enforcement around the health fraud and abuse laws. The government has a really great rate of return on enforcement activities. It makes a whole lot of money for every dollar it puts into it. And part of the increase in enforcement has clearly been related to real or whistleblower claims. Whistleblower claims come from all different places. We're seeing whistleblowers who are committing physicians. We see compliance officers, chief operating officers, directors over physician services. They're really coming from all different directions, and they raise sort of level of concern we need to have around the appropriateness of our arrangements with physicians. There are a couple of recent cases within the last few weeks that have come out, settlements related to Stark and anti-kickback. And I've heard of them. One is a health system based in Florida, and the other Broward Health, which is also, I think, based in Florida. The settlement is the largest non-trial case. In other words, it was a case that did not go to trial. It just simply settled, and it was for $115 million. And the Broward settlement, I think, was $69 million. Broward was brought by a competing physician, not an employee of the hospital he went after, whereas the Adventist case was brought by Adventist system employees. I think advance to the next slide. So these settlements, I think, suggest that we are entering into an even more challenging regulatory environment. And the reason I say that is that some things that were highlighted in the complaints and the settlement documents relate to things like physician losses. So if a physician practice is losing money, then does that mean you've virtually unreasonable and therefore you violated the Stark Law? Another thing that the settlements have pointed to is financial data that is kept kind of in the normal course of business within health systems related to revenue that might be generated by physicians, primary care physicians, downstream in the hospital setting. Basically, look at the total financial impact of employing a physician. Those types of documents are highlighted in recent settlements and used to suggest that This is deliberately in physicians for the purpose of getting downstream revenue, and even those may have been high-level financial documents. So there appears to be a willingness on the part of the government and certainly whistleblowers to basically throw everything up against the wall and see what sticks, and paint a pretty dismal picture of what's taking place. So we're looking at this carefully from a legal and compliance perspective. We're looking at how we need to respond to this movement towards an even more challenging regulatory environment, and there'll be more to come on that. I think I'm going to save the rest for Sherry.
Okay, thank you, Peter. So I wanted to talk to the group about how CHI is mitigating risk associated with physician enterprise, so that you can understand some of the internal quality controls that we have in place to mitigate some of this risk. So you may be aware of some of the operational policies and procedures that we have, that Catholic Health Initiatives has. Legal policy number 9 establishes the process for review of proposed transactions with physicians, and it speaks to the type of transactions that will be reviewed and how often they should be reviewed. It defines who those reviewing parties are and the order of the review, and it establishes the required templates and supporting documentation for physician transactions. We also have the gifts policies, corporate responsibility policy number 1. It establishes guidelines for arrangements between employees of CHI and vendors or referral sources. Governance policy number 1, conflicts of interest, which you may be well familiar with in your fiduciary role. I'm going to speak to it from the perspective of physician reporting of conflicts of interest. In the past, we had not asked for independent, non-employed physicians who not serve in governance type or leadership type roles to complete a conflicts of interest, and we'll be rolling that out soon. And it's kind of in response to open payments and Sunshine Act type reporting, which we'll talk a little bit about. Then there's also stewardship policy number 18, setting forth that CHI entities will not purchase from physician-owned entities. That policy was established in direct response to IG fraud alert. Indicated, there was high risk with purchasing from physician-owned entities because that might influence the medical decision making. And then we have CHI physician compensation standards and procedures. Kent alluded to those earlier in his portion of the presentation. We'll talk a little bit more about that because I want the audience to understand how those processes support support the documentation process for fair market value and commercial reasonableness of physician transactions. And there's also local market policies related to progressive action plans around clinical documentation, medical staff bylaws, and et cetera. Auditing and monitoring is another risk mitigation process. There's operational auditing and monitoring in addition to compliance or corporate responsibility auditing and monitoring. Billing and coding reviews should be taking place on a routine basis from an operations perspective, not only to review for potential compliance concerns, but typically, there may be revenue opportunities or care that should be documented and billed for. So it's a great way for operations to continually monitor and educate physicians on their clinical documentation. We also audit from a compliance perspective, risk-based, and we'll talk about that in a couple of dot points. Clinical appropriateness reviews similar, but just relate to the clinical appropriateness of care. Then we have in place data analytics process and risk-based monitoring, where we're looking at the claims data that CMS is also looking at. CMS has published for a few years hospital claims data and is published for the second year in a row physician claims data. They're actively working that data through what is called the fraud prevention system and looking for outliers and actually stopping payments when they feel it's necessary on a prospective basis. So we are reviewing our own data internally, looking for those outliers, and then conducting reviews where we see there's potential risk based on that. In terms of open payments, or you probably know this more as the Sunshine Act, and this was CMS's one of their strategies for transparency with physicians and providers, and they require vendors to report ownership interests that physicians have or payments that are made to physicians, and that is published on the CMS website. So we are reviewing that information in our markets. It's reported a couple of years behind. So as we roll out the conflicts of interest process to our employed and non-employed providers on our medical staff, we're going to be comparing that information, researching as appropriate, working with our legal teams to determine whether there's any potential conflicts that are of concern. So we'll be actively reviewing that info. In our due diligence process, pre-transaction or pre-hire, conduct appropriate due diligence to understand any potential compliance risks that we would be taking on. I'll reference you to another corporate responsibility governance webcast called Diligence, a Governance Perspective, and would also encourage you to listen to that if you'd like some more information about the due diligence process. And monitoring adherence to policies and procedures, and monitoring adherence to contract terms. Typically, those would be around the higher risk arrangements, such as medical directorships, co-management agreements, and et cetera. Those have to be very strictly monitored, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So in terms of the CHI provider compensation standards and procedures, those were established in 2012 and they were revised in 2015. And they were established in order to facilitate the physician compensation process. So the standards detail CHI's approach to compensation, physician and provider compensation. They set benchmark and compensation standards and really set forth the compensation review process. The additional review criteria for highly compensated and highly productive providers, and in other words, those highly productive providers are more likely to be the ones that are kind of falling out in the claims data. They might be an outlier for one procedure or another, not necessarily that that anything's being done inappropriately, just that they're very busy. But when you're talking about matching up or how to compensate these providers, and you're tying it to their productivity. You may have a highly productive provider who also ends up being highly compensated, and there's additional review criteria that's spelled out for those particular scenarios. So, for example, where we have a physician who is producing at the 90th percentile or above, we want to conduct a billing and coding review to make sure that the physician is documenting the care in a way that can be supported in the event of an external audit. If they're producing at 150% of the 90th percentile, we're required to conduct a clinical appropriateness review just to ensure that everything's supported in the event of an external audit. And then we typically use benchmark data to determine fair market value. The government is pretty good with us relying on benchmark data, but there's certain situations where we may want to get an independent fair market value. That may be where compensation is well above the 90th, where there's a large gap between productivity and compensation. And so the standards really call out those requirements and help us to cases, if you will, in terms of documenting fair market value and commercial reasonableness. Because if the care is not being documented well and we're paying the physician based on that care, then it's not necessary. We wouldn't be able to support fair market value in that case. The expectation is that before transactions go to the physician transaction review body, that they've gone through this process. And that is referenced in Legal Policy Number 10, which is the fiduciary policy that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But again, they should have been through this process and be coming to the transaction review body bodies and completed the required reviews that are spelled out in the compensation standards and procedures. In terms of the considerations for fiduciary board, policy number 10 is the fiduciary review policy related to physician arrangement review. So currently our physician arrangement review bodies are the physician transaction review committees, and that's currently a separate body. And of course, those committees are either going to be part of the executive committee of the board or the audit and compliance committee, and those determinations are being made. And that's why I'm going to continue to use the term transaction review body. And so the goal of the physician transaction review body would be to read the dates and documentations that are required by legal policy number 9, and all the support documentation that's required by the compensation standards and procedures to ensure fair market value is supported, is documented appropriately, and we have good financial and operational controls in place that will sustain that. We need to ensure that the charitable and business purpose is adequately documented. Management's really shown deliberation in preparing those pre-transaction documents. They should stand alone. And so if that information is not sufficient, the transaction review body certainly has the right to ask management for more information in order to be able to carry out those determinations. Excuse me. In conjunction with the Department of Health and Human Services, published new guidance on compliance oversight for healthcare governing boards, and I've included the link on this slide. And that resource is an educational resource that is intended to assist governing healthcare boards to carry out their compliance oversight obligations. And it's more prescriptive than previous guidance that was out there. The objectives of the guidance are to clarify roles and responsibilities, such as legal compliance, HR, quality, establish some guidelines for reporting, how to be identified, and how fiduciary boards can encourage compliance in an organization. So overall, boards and the transaction review committee should understand the risks that are related to physician enterprise, controls and processes that are in place to mitigate those risks, evaluate how well the processes are followed, and then request that management follow up as necessary if there's additional information that's needed. So I want a bit about points to consider as physician transactions are being reviewed. There is a document called the transaction checklist that includes things like the terms of the transaction, the compensation as compared to benchmark, whether or not there's a recommendation from CHI Physician Services. When a reason required by CHI Physician Services, that is spelled out in the compensation standards document that we talked about earlier. There are guardrails which CHI Physician Services will not go outside, and an example of that is the compensation cap. CHI Physician Services will not make a recommendation for compensation arrangements that are over 150% of the 90th percentile. There may be other reasons or certain pieces of a compensation agreement that they're not comfortable with, and that's going to be notated on the checklist. And so the transaction review body should understand, why there's a no recommendation and what those questions are. And should also be if independent appraisals are required, if coding and billing and medical necessity review results are required per the policy. Results should be not necessarily included in detail, but at least reported out. Compensation cap should be noted in the document, and then in the section of the checklist that includes additional arrangements with the physician or the group. It's also important information to review. If a physician is in multiple arrangements with an entity, such as a medical directorship and maybe a couple of medical directorships plus an employment agreement, that really needs to be evaluated to ensure that there's a sustained bona fide need for those services, that the services are not duplicated. So all the transactions should make sense, given the mission and strategy of the organization, the population that's being served by the organization, and the services that are provided by the organization. Really, there should be community needs assessments that support the need for, say, 25 primary care physicians in the area, or perhaps there's covered in the clinically integrated network and you need to cover a particular specialty, or perhaps you don't have enough intensivists to cover your ICU bed. So those are the types of things that kind of give you a sense of the business purpose of the transaction. There's a similar arrangement in the market. If there's differing compensation for same specialty, what monitoring is going to take place to ensure that we can manage that, different agreement. And the point about terms being operationalized and easily adhered to, enforcement of contract terms, really the integrity of financial arrangements includes also operational and financial oversight. And sometimes this is the missing link, or where organizations may get in trouble, because most organizations do a really good job of setting up legal contracts, but it's easy to fall out of compliance if we are not managing those agreements always within the scope of the term. So if we make a payment that's outside the scope, or that's based on an erroneous calculation, then we cannot continue to maintain fair market value, and then all of a sudden we're out of compliance. So we must be able to follow the contracts as written, have quality checks and those the assurance controls in place, be able to maintain those safe harbors at all times and those stark requirements for employment or other exceptions. So the takeaways here for board members: Physician Enterprises is a significant strategic initiative for CHI. Arrangements with physicians carry considerable risk, and that, I'd say the risk is, even in the last few months, probably grown around these types of arrangements. Adequate internal controls need to be in place, including periodic monitoring, for that we are operating within the terms of those agreements, and that they're fair market value. So physician arrangements review bodies need to have adequate information to determine whether the arrangements are clearly documented, whether they're fair market value, and whether potential conflicts are identified and appropriately adjudicated. Well, it's 5:15 where I am in the Eastern Time Zone, so we'd like to open it up at this time for questions. Open up the line for questions.
Certainly, and ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to ask a question, please press star 1 on your telephone's keypad. Again, that's star 1 if you would like to ask a question.
This is Michelle. Maybe while we're waiting for questions, I might just pose one question to you. Can you speak a little bit to what due diligence work is done when a contract goes forward that's outside the parameters where the Physician Compensation Committee would be comfortable reviewing it? Some of the diligence work we do on medical necessity. Could you speak to that, just to provide a little insight to the board on that?
In terms of just the parameters, or when that requirement is?
Yeah, when the requirements, when the requirement, okay, and why we do it.
Okay. So if there's annual compensation that's in excess of the relevant 90th percentile external benchmark, that requires an exception review by the CHI Physician Services Review Panel. There's a new compensation arrangement, a new provider that's in excess of the relevant 75th percentile that also requires an exception review. If there's a significant gap between provider compensation and productivity, and the compensation is over the 90th percentile, we require an external fair market value opinion on that. And then billing and coding reviews are required when compensation is exceeding the 90th percentile, because again, typically we're paying physicians based on production. So if we can't ensure that the production we're paying them for is adequately documented, we can't support fair market value. So we require billing and coding reviews where total comp is projected to exceed the 90th percentile. And then if there is clinical appropriateness review, if compensation is over the 90th percentile is required on contract renewal, but if a provider is exceeding 150% of the relevant 90th percentile, an annual billing and coding and clinical appropriateness review is required. Did that question, Michelle?
Yeah, and really just to stress that the primary reason why we do that is because CHI wants to make sure that if there's a circumstance where we are paying a physician in excess of what fair market value is telling us we should pay, there's a reason. And some cases that have come out recently against physicians have found medical necessity and whether the physician is doing too many procedures or are doing procedures that don't meet clinical standards, and therefore they're able to do more procedures or bill more procedures because they're doing them too quickly or not doing them appropriately. So we've really built this control in so that if we do have a high-performing physician, we understand that what that physician is doing is clinical standards as well as billing standards, and that's why we put that in place.
And I think I'll say, too, that the government seems to take the position that anything over the 75th percentile should be really well justified. We want to make sure that that's how we feel we are, appropriately substantiating that.
Right. We have.
This is Drew. I was just going to add that I'd say about that as a board member, I would still approach physician compensation review with a deal of and wouldn't just take what the or hospital or clinic ship at face value. I think this is an area where active participation is really important. And so if you have questions about we're justifying being a physician over the 90th, or in cases where we're exceeding 150% of the 90th, I think those are cases where we need active participation from panel review members or board members who are involved in those reviews.
Yeah, Peter, a great comment, and something that we stress highly because this area is one area that we know the government's focused on. There's a lot of organizational pressure to have strong physician relationships, and really the board is there to provide kind of an independent oversight and stay away from all the operational components, but really look at it from a global perspective and say that even is commercially reasonable that we're doing this transaction, and does it make the most sense considering all factors, both the clients, the operational, and the strategic factors. And so we are relying on board members to provide that independence in that oversight. Those are involved in reviewing these contracts. Okay, do we have individual questions?
No questions, thank you, at this time.
Okay, if anybody does have questions after the webcast, please feel free to reach out to us or your local corporate responsibility officer. I also will mention we record these sessions, and we will send out a notice to all the board and committee members in the next couple weeks about how to access these recordings. So if you want to listen to it again, or you want to have another board member at your facility listen to it and share it with them, we encourage you to share this. We will continue to offer these. We focus on topics that we think are the greatest interest for the board and the compliance committees. If you have suggestions for other areas you'd like specific focused education, please let your corporate responsibility officer or myself know. We'd be happy to tailor one of these programs to meet your needs. All of the previous sessions that we've done are also available out there in the queue, and when we send out the notice, we include the link to where you can go and listen to some of the referenced sessions that we talked about today and those sitting in our library. Appreciate your time today, and we hope you found the session valuable. Thank you.
That concludes today's conference. We thank you for your participation. You may now disconnect. Have a great day.